Yes, ma'am. We'll just go and we would like to welcome everyone. We are very glad to welcome you all to the second talk of the academic writing workshop organized by the Department of History, Lady Shri Ram College. Some of you were here for our previous talk also. And we are now privileged and very elated to have amongst us today Ms. Nayana Das Gupta, who will be delivering a lecture on the topic Formulating a Research Question. Ma'am is an associate professor of history at the Department of History, LSR. Her research interests include medieval Indian history, the cultural history of Bengal, particularly from the gender vantage. Ma'am has written for numerous prestigious publications and is currently pursuing her PhD. Without any further delay, we would now request ma'am to please take over and begin. We are very excited for the talk.
Thank you. Thank you, Anushka. Once again, am I audible? Am I visible?
Yes, ma'am,
clearly?
Absolutely.
Okay, thank you. And good morning to all of you and a warm hello to everyone who's here. I'm sure all of you have been part of the previous session and heard Vasudha ma'am speaking about the idea of research as such. And I think in a way that I feel that she's already kind of framed the discussion for all the coming sessions by talking about research, particularly research in history, as a larger philosophical question. What is going to be done, I think, in the course of the next few sessions is to really talk about the nitty-gritty of how we go about doing our research. And of course, this session is the first step in that direction when we talk about the first step in that direction, which is namely the framing of the research question. Of course, with a slight question mark there, is it really the first step? So now I'm sure this is not the first time you have you have encountered the question of a research question, and why a research question, what is a research question, etc. I'm sure you already had plenty of opportunities to reflect on this question numerous times. Particularly though all of you are undergraduate students, I believe, this is the brief I had. And I'm sure that all of you, while writing your papers for your projects, you have to write research papers for your project, have already encountered this question of how you should frame a research question, what is a research question, and so on. So I really I don't claim to have come here with a set of completely new ideas, things that none of you have ever thought about. Rather, I would see this more as a conversation between all of us, where at best, I hope to make you a little more aware or a little more conscious of ideas that you're already familiar with. Maybe sort of draw them out in a way that, in a sense, some of these ideas we know in an instinctual kind of way. Sometimes we're not fully conscious of them. So that is really one of the purposes of this session. And I also hope it'll be an opportunity to raise fresh questions on this once again. And as I said, let this be a conversation where your questions should steer the course of this sort of discussion as much as some of my opening remarks would be. So, I would like to begin with some opening remarks, and then I would be very happy to have questions coming in to make this more of a discussion. And also, I'd just like to mention that I would like this discussion to address both the level of formal research, which we do in, instituted kind of way, in institutional kind of ways, where you do research, let's say for a formal research degree, like an MPhil or a PhD, or, or research of, funded research of various kinds, etc. Incidentally, I'm currently engaged, I'm right in the middle of doing my own PhD, and it would be useful, it would be sort of easy for me to talk out of my own experience of research, therefore. I would also like to address the level at which you currently find yourself, which is at the undergraduate level, where, as I already mentioned before, you would find yourself seized with these questions when you're writing your research paper for your project and so on, or for other multiple you would be writing research papers for all kinds of other things as well. So I hope you would find this sort of useful to do all of your kind of work as well. So let us begin at the very beginning, which is, why, which is the most basic question actually, which is why do we need a research question at all? I mean, do we need it really? You begin research with a topic, right? All of you begin with a topic, and when you begin with a topic, many students, many sort of young scholars often sort of plunge into research. They begin their research with the research topic itself. So why is that not enough? Why do we need to have a research question framed separately from the topic? Why do we need to have a research question or a set of research questions and so on? So that is the question that I would like to begin with, and just hold on to that question. We'll just come back to it in a moment. Since many of you, I don't know whether all of you are third year students or are there first and second year students as well. First year students probably would still remember what happened in school, and I'm sure so would all of you at some or the other level. And I'm sure, and I'm aware of CBSE and how it functions, and the fact that you have to do projects in your 11th and 12th standards as well, and you have to write a research paper for that. You have to write a paper for that, which is often referred to as the research paper. And when you're writing this paper, I'm sure it's not just CBSE, but I'm sure in all other boards as well, there are sort of similar kind of situations for which you have to do research and you have to write a paper. And in school, very often you're instructed, when you begin to do a paper of this kind, you're often instructed to do research, which usually is taken to mean that you must look up, a host of websites. You must look at multiple websites and gather information. You should look for information, scout for information, and then you need to collect that information, collate it, arrange it, make it look very coherent and cogent, and then write it out and present it, often on very fancy paper and so on, which is not really what you need to do anymore, of course. But the first idea that we kind of we kind of have to unlearn when we come into as you progress in your academic life, as you go from from school, when you move towards graduation and then towards post-graduation, and then of course for formal research programs like the MPhil, the PhD, or postdoctoral research and so on, increasingly you realize that research is not really about gathering of information. Of course, you do still need to gather information and collate information while doing your research, but that increasingly remains only a certain part, if not a very small part. It's only a part of your entire sort of enterprise as a researcher. It doesn't constitute the whole. So what you're going to be doing now as a researcher is not to only sort of summarize existing knowledge and kind of put it together, but basically to problematize the already existing knowledge, look for gaps within those, look for unanswered questions, and also see if, look for possibilities of raising new questions from, let's say, old material, old sources which have been explored by a whole host of historians already. You may need to, I'm so sorry. Excuse me. You may need to think afresh about those sources and sort of revisit them and ask fresh questions. So all of that is really, so what you would be really doing as a researcher now is not to summarize existing knowledge, but to actually construct new knowledge. It's a completely different kind of endeavor. Now, for this kind of purpose, just a research topic is not going to be good enough. And that is really where the research question becomes important. Of course, that is not to say that, these two are entirely separate. Very often, if you're able to frame your topic in a way that it hints at your research question, your task is always made a little easier because you move that, one step ahead. And yet, even if you have done that, I would still suggest that it is always better to frame your research questions, your research question or your questions. In fact, I would like to also suggest right here that there is, the way that we frame the topic for this session is formulating the research question. It seems to sort of suggest that there is this one grand research question that we have in mind. But very often when you're doing research, you actually function with a set of research questions, and that is more often the case than having that one question. So we come back to our question, which is, what is really the need for a research question? What purposes does it serve? As I see it, a research question or research questions are more like tools, are tools that will help you work with your material and fashion out something that is completely unique and new. And it is no wonder, to continue with the analogy of tools of let's say a workman, of a craftsperson. The point is that the sharper your tools are, the more efficient your process of work and your final outcome would be. And as I said, it's no wonder, therefore, that a clever, it's often said that a clever workman or a woman would first want to really sharpen their tools before they begin to go about their work. In fact, this is something that, in way back in the most ancient of times, the Chinese philosopher, sage, etc., Confucius, whose name all of us are familiar with, is said to have, spoken about something similar. He's quoted as having said that the mechanic who wishes to perfect his work must first sharpen his tools. So that is really what the research question is. The sharper your questions, the more specific they are, the more well-tuned they are, the better, the possibility of the outcome being better is that much greater. You may also think of your research questions as navigational tools, which would help you find your way through, let's say, your primary sources, or in your case, your secondary sources. And here, as I have already sort of threatened, I would like to illustrate from my own research, since I'm currently engaged in research myself. I'm working on the corpus of the Mangal Kavya literature currently, and my inquiry really is about the construction of sexual identity of women in medieval Bengal. Using, of course, the Mangal Kavyas being my archives. That is what I'm kind of looking at to address these kinds of questions. Now, the Mangal Kavya literature is replete with material on the period that they were composed in, which is roughly the period from the 15th to the 18th centuries. It is replete with material on various aspects of social, political, religious, cultural, life of economic, and so on, life of the people at that time. So if you wish to say something about, let's say, long distance trade or commerce at that time, you would find something in the Mangal Kavyas. If you wish to say something about the political sort of institutions, about the ideas of kingship, etc., you would find something in the Mangal Kavyas. If you wanted to work on, let's say, caste formation or caste mobility, you would find something on the Mangal Kavya. So what I'm trying to say is that it's a treasure house, it's a treasure trove for historians to mine. And indeed, historians have actually worked. A lot of historians have worked with very, very divergent set of questions. Using the Mangal Kavyas as their sources, and for each of them, it has yielded rich material for them to be able to say something meaningful out of it. Now, when I'm looking at those same sources, once again, I'm encountering all of this vast sort of treasure of material. And so how do I really figure out, and how do I really work out what is useful for my purpose? Because there's so much that is to be found, a very interesting material on the way that these authors, these poets, who are all sort of upper caste, mostly Brahmin, upper caste sort of male authors, writing Hindu male authors, writing about Muslims, for example. How are Muslims being portrayed? There's so much material on the idea of the relationship between the different castes and so on. Now, I'm certainly not, I might encounter all of that material, but I'm not going to be able to use all of that, but because it doesn't really fit the framework of my research. And what really helps me discern what is useful for me and what may not really be so useful for me is really my research question. So that is why I have first needed to frame those out in order to be able to navigate my sources. And of course, I must say this right away that that the primary source is obviously like a bit of a maze. It's like a labyrinth, and you have to find your way through this whole mass of material. But for everyone, the route that you take through the labyrinth is a different one, depending completely entirely on your sort of research interest, on your line of inquiry, and finally the kind of research questions that you have framed. So I would like to share with you a few of the questions that I have been working with. So as I said, I'm working on the construction of the sexual identity of women in medieval Bengal, and I'm looking at it through the Mangal Kavyas. So what are my questions? One question is a very basic fundamental question, is how were women and their roles in family and society understood and represented in these texts. Obviously, these are texts written, as I just told you, by male, upper caste male authors. How is it that they are understanding and portraying the role of women in family and society? There are a lot of there's a lot of didactic material almost telling women how to conduct themselves, how to sort of carry themselves through their lives. They're being told a lot of things about the importance of chastity in conjugal relations, about the importance of conjugal relations itself, and so on. Now, so another question I have that I'm working with is, are there any possible gaps between between the desired normative, the didactic element that is there where you're being told what to do, and between what is the accepted real practice? Are there these gaps? So that's another question. Another question is about how some of the descriptions, some of the discussions in the text are an element of male fantasy, are an element of male sexual imagination, and whether that imagination represents the deep-seated fears and anxieties about female sexuality. So the portrayal of female sexuality is therefore in multiple ways. So this is another question. I also am asking a question about whether these texts also reflect women's own understanding of their subjectivity, of their sort of place in the hierarchical order of the patriarchal social order. I'm asking questions about whether it is possible to see not just women's awareness of this subjective position, but also whether it reflects their own negotiations within this very confining patriarchal order, whether it also represents some form of subversions of this social structure. These are just questions. I'm not saying whether there is really material that answers this question or not, but this is a question I started out with. And of course, generally the question of how sexual identities were forged and constituted within a framework of social prescriptions. I am also asking the question about how the social construction of such identities of women intersect with the material realities of the times, with the let's say the economic and other kinds of aspects of this period. And finally, I'm trying to also look at the diachronic aspect, where I ask the question whether there are transformations over time that you can see through the various sources. The Mangal Kavya texts were composed, as I said, between the 15th to the 18th centuries, and the same stories are often written and rewritten, composed and recomposed by new authors, by new poets. The core of the story remaining the same, but a lot of the details become absolutely new and different. So within these retellings, I wish to look at whether there are transformations that one can see in the questions that I'm asking about, the portrayal of women's sexuality and so on. And whether this tells us about transformation in the social cultural world of medieval Bengali society from the 15th to the 18th centuries, medieval as unchanging, static, the Dark Ages and so on. So whether it is possible to look at transformation and whether it is possible, therefore, to look at it as an evolving, dynamic sort of process and system rather than a stagnant one. And finally, I have a set of questions about the human nature interactions, and whether they are of a gendered nature, and if that is reflected also in the Mangal Kavyas. So this is a set of questions that I kind of started out with, which brings me to the next comment that I wish to make before we start off on our discussion, which is that, how do you arrive at these questions? You cannot you've thought of a topic and you're interested in a particular area, and you've thought of a corpus of, let's say, literature, or you're looking at some other kind of primary sources. Maybe you're looking at inscriptions, maybe you're looking at archival, state-generated records, and so on, or whatever your source may be. You've thought of a topic, you've thought out what your sources are going to be. You cannot sort of, in a dream, sort of imagine the questions that you will be asking of your sources. So which is what I meant when I had posed that question right in the beginning, that is it really the first step? Well, yes and no, because actually you keep on doing a back and forth, because when you begin your research, and here again, another thing that I want to kind of hint at, and I don't want to get into it in too much detail. I want that to come out through your questions and, be able to address them through the discussion, is the question of objectivity. I mean, as the researcher, do we really have, as researchers, do we really have any agency in not just asking your research questions, but in sort of generating knowledge, in creating and constructing new knowledge, in any way? So first of all, we must remember that all of us are, as human beings, are actually social beings. We're located in a particular social matrix. So our location in that particular location in that matrix, whether you're a man or a woman, you're sort of, what economic class you belong to, what caste you belong to, what race you belong to, what geographical region you may come from. All of these are factors which shape, the kind of research interest we may have. It may shape the kind of things we seek out from our sources, and therefore also shape our research questions. In fact, I'm sure all of you have at some point or the other encountered these discussions in your classrooms about the whole evolution of history as a discipline itself. From the 19th century sort of Rankian positivist kind of notion of history writing, where it was assumed that the historian is merely instrumental in, taking the story forward, but it is really the facts which speak for themselves. The task of the historian was basically to collate, to gather the facts, put them on the table, and like a jigsaw puzzle, one day they would all the pieces would fit, and it would sort of tell its own story. We've come a long way from that, and I'm sure all of you have read your sort of E.H. Carr's What is History, and maybe Mark Bloch's Historian's Craft, and so on. And you probably are already aware that we're long past that point where there is that assumption that history is a purely objective exercise. It's a neutral exercise where, a researcher or a historian approaches sources with a completely empty mind, with no bias and no sort of presupposition whatsoever, and only sort of gleans out of it what is available. So we all know that is a complete myth. There cannot ever be pure objectivity because, as I just said, all of us have a certain location in the social matrix which we sort of belong to, and of which we are a part. And our location and the nature of our life experiences will shape the kind of approach we have towards our sources and the questions we ask of them. So that brings me back to the question of the research question, which is that once your life experiences, or let's say your politics, and it's very important to use that word here. I mean, I'm not just throwing it in here for some effect. The first thing that one needs to realize is that the choices we make of the research interests we have, the choices we make of the sources we look at, and the choices we make of the questions we're asking are all political choices. Okay, we may be conscious of those, or we may not be conscious of those. But even if we are not conscious of those, and we seem to think, and we feel that we are completely neutral, and we are completely objective and unbiased, then let me tell you that that is never going to be the case. So we must begin. It's always begin to begin. It's always good to begin with an understanding of this subjectivity, this subjective position. And of course, as I said, if you have read your cars, this is a question that historians and people who have reflected on the philosophy of history, on the craft of history writing, have often really talked about, which is that if you recognize that it is not possibly to be purely objective in your quest, is it all right to give up, the quest for the aim of objectivity altogether? Should we then just submit to the idea that since everything is relative, since everything is, all knowledge is subjective, there is no absolute truth? Is there no purpose then in trying to reconstruct the past or the present or whatever you're researching on, with the idea of trying to the truth? So, like Carr and others have said, it lies somewhere in between. The exercise of writing history, the exercise of researching in history, is located somewhere in between this understanding that history is a purely objective craft, and from it being a purely biased, prejudiced, subjective kind of an exercise. So we're located somewhere in the middle. And similarly, therefore, with your research questions. So we must begin with that. It's absolutely all right to recognize that we are all coming from subjective positions, and that we all are approaching sources with a set of beliefs and presuppositions and so on. But what is important is that we should be aware of our subjectivity, we should be aware of our subjective positions, and if possible, also open that up and unravel that. To be able to carry out, as impartial and as objective an exercise as possible. We must always strive for that. So we come back to that question of, how we then arrive at the research question. As I said, it's not something that there's no moment of enlightenment when all of that will occur to you on its own. So, you certainly need to have some familiarity with your sources. So once you have decided on your research interest, and very often when students are deciding on their project, on their topics for their research project, this is a conversation we have. Ma'am, what do I do my project on? So the first thing I often suggest to students that I have been talking to is, what area of history or what area of life in general are you really interested in? So depending on that, now if you're looking at, if you're researching on things that already interest you, I'm sure it is, you understand very well that the passion, the engagement with which you will really actually grapple with your sources and your work is going to be that much more. So it always makes sense, first of all, to choose your own areas of interest. And when you're researching a particular period, a particular historical context, to look for, those aspects interest you already in life. So let's say you're looking at cultural history. So we've been doing these courses on cultures in India in the past, cultural history of India, etc. And very often after this conversation, when students come back for the next tutorial discussion, armed with what they're going to be doing their project about, they come with things like, I want to do it on temple architecture in India, right? Now, or I want to do it on the on classical music in India. In a certain period, in a certain location, and space and time being defined and so on. Now that is actually really the first step, but when you have to frame the research question, you have to go further from there. So if you have narrowed down your interest area as, let's say, classical music in a certain period and time in Indian history, the set of questions that you need to, the direction in which you have to move in your research will be determined to a large extent by the kind of questions that you then frame. Now, if you're going to look at, let's say, I'm just speaking off the top of my head now. You have a question on, you want to look at, let's say, caste hierarchies in that period, and you want to look at it through classical music. All right. So when you do that, you're going to have to ask questions which are very specific, like, who are the people who are involved in the imparting of this kind of music? Who are the people who then become the repositories of this kind of knowledge? Is everyone allowed entry into this knowledge system? Is everyone sort of equally does everyone have equal access to partake of this kind of knowledge, musical knowledge and so on? What is the patronage system? Who funds it? What are the spaces? What are the locations in which this is imparted? Now, these are the kinds of questions which will then shape the direction in which you're going to take your research in. This is one example, of course, that you work with so many others. So as I was saying, I was giving you an illustration from my own work. The kind of questions that I put before you are not questions that got constructed or formulated before I began the research. So needless to say that once you have formulated, you have worked out your broad area of interest. Let's say I thought about the fact that I'm very interested in looking at, aspects of gender, aspects of the history of gender in medieval Bengali society, and I'm looking at it through the Mangal Kavya text. Once I have decided on that, and I have done a preliminary reading of my sources, I get a sense of the kind of things these sources may or may not yield. So depending on that, I then frame a set of questions to begin with. So in most cases, when you're doing research at a formal institutional level, let's say, for PhDs, etc., you are always required to put forward a research proposal. And I'm sure all of you know about that. When you put forward a research proposal, you are expected to lay out some of these questions in detail, some of these questions that you're going to explore through your research. The committee of the set of people who usually decide whether or not your research is worth, taking on, let's say, giving you an admission, a seat for a PhD program, or if you're applying for funded research, there would be a set of people who would be looking at your research proposal to decide whether or not, your research is worth getting the funds and so on. A lot of you, I'm sure, are also applying for, for courses abroad where once you reach your third year, and you know this process already. You have to write a SOP, and you have to talk about what you want to work on. And once you pass the postgraduate stage, you're actually when you're doing research, you're expected to frame out your research questions in detail. You do that at that stage with this preliminary kind of sense of what are the kind of questions you're looking at, what is your basic line of inquiry. But as you progress in your research, as you begin to sort of delve into your sources deeper and deeper, and as you keep trying to write out, produce something as written work out of what you're looking at, from those sources, you find that your questions are getting sort of reworked and reshaped, right? Some of those questions actually may not remain valid after a point of time. Once you have gone deeper and deeper into your sources, you might find that some of your questions become completely redundant for various reasons. Either because the sources do not really yield any very substantive sort of material on that, or because it's something that is so obvious that there's no big point in really pursuing that line of inquiry as a valid sort of research question. On the other hand, there would be other research questions that you have begun with, which may get rephrased, reframed, and sometimes completely modified as you go along. Right. So these are some of the things that I wanted to sort of open up before we go in for the discussion. So Anushka, will you tell me how much time we have now, and should we can I open the floor for questions so that we can take this conversation forward?
Yes, ma'am. You can definitely open the floor for questions if you want to start the discussion now.
Right. So how much time do we have left in this session? Another 15-20 minutes?
15 to 20 minutes, yes, ma'am.
All right. So, well, I don't know if what I've said has made any sense to you beyond what you, I'm sure, already know, and questions that you have already been sort of struggling with. Please, I mean, I would be very happy to engage in some conversations with all of you as well. So, any questions, please?
Yes, ma'am.
Yes.
Thank you, ma'am, for sharing with us your wonderful time and delivering this lecture. We would now like to open the floor for discussion. If anyone has any question or anything you would like to share, please unmute your mic. You can also type it in the chat box and we will read it out aloud.
Okay.
Hello, ma'am. I'm Shobit. I have a question. So, ma'am, can you please emphasize on like how to narrow down the primary bibliographical source? Like, as an undergrad student, we refer to the biblical sources as our primary sources. So, like, how to narrow it down in order to get through our research questions like more accurate? Because there are many times, when we think of something, like we have multiple thoughts about a question that we can frame around. And then we get to know that it's like already most of the work has been done around it, or like whatnot and all. It's like how to actually get through it more accurately, so that so if something could be done.
Okay. So I don't know if I've understood your question properly, but I try and address it with reference to my experience as a teacher, working with students at the undergraduate level, trying to write their research papers. And you're absolutely right that when at this level, when you're doing research, we in the way that we function. I mean, of course, that is not to say that this is the only way it can be at undergraduate level, but very often the way that we function is that students are only encouraged to look at secondary sources. There are problems, of course, and for good reason, in the sense that very often, if you're looking at, let's say, you want to do a research paper on some theme from ancient India. Now, you do not, it would require a certain amount of knowledge in the languages that have been used, in the kind of text, in the kinds of sources, maybe they're epigraphical, maybe they're numismatic sources. The training that is required to read those sources is often not really imparted at the undergraduate level. So, which leaves us with a situation where students are mostly looking at secondary sources. As you rightly said, everything that could be said, often it seems like all of that has really been said already by historians or by social scientists who worked on these topics. Now, and of course that is genuinely a handicap. But I would also like to say that at the level of this undergraduate research, where you're only consulting secondary sources, you are never really expected to have to come up with finite answers or new answers to to questions, answers which have never been found. And this is also true for research at higher levels as well. Research is not really about being able to provide finite or perfect answers. Research is actually much more about being able to open up possibilities of asking meaningful questions. Now, when you're looking at your secondary sources at the undergraduate level, and you're looking, and if I can sort of get down to brass tacks and talk in more practical ways, in the ways that I find students often struggling with. So very often what happens I've seen happening with a lot of my students is that some begin very early with very ambitious themes, because that's something that they've been thinking about. That is an area they're interested in. That's a question they're interested in. And then they begin to look for the sources. So you do searches these days, Google Scholar, and there's so many other platforms on which you can actually find good academic material, research material. So unlike school, you do not have to look at Wikipedia and those kinds of sources anymore. So you look at research material. And you try and find possibilities of raising questions that you can possibly do from those sources. On the other hand, there are students who will, and of course your questions will get reshaped along the way. There are sometimes students who will want to do something very grand, very, very interesting, and I'm I feel very happy to find those ideas. But they have, sort of not really started exploring in time. And you know better than me that there are those time constraints that all of you have to work with. You have so many courses in a semester. You have so many papers to write, so many assignments to do. That very often what happens is that you have a grand idea, but you haven't been able to explore your archives, in good enough time. And which is when I often have to say, sort of share this practical kind of idea that now probably it should be the bibliography that determines your questions. So look for what you can easily find. What are the easily available material you find in the library, or of course, these days it's a little more, it's a little easier because it's a much more expanded library because there's so much material online. But once you have looked at, you have found the written material, the secondary material that you want to work with, roughly around the topic of your interest, I think a reading of those sources will then actually give you an insight into what kind of questions you can frame. And as I have said to you, the questions can come from, the questions can be reshaped as you kind of go along with your readings. Where I would like to use this opportunity to make another point. Where do research questions actually come from? I've been constantly saying, your interest, your research interest, and there is a politics to your interest, and so on and so forth. So let me illustrate that with reference to, let's say, environmental history, which is another area which I'm deeply interested in. So in environmental history, if you see the trajectory of how environmental history has kind of emerged as a new discipline, as a new sub-discipline or a sub-area within history, and kind of evolved and grown from there, you'll find that, there are multiple ways in which those interests have been formed and environmental history has been researched. So if you look at the Annales work in France, one would say that is more of an internalist position where from within the discipline, you are initiating an inquiry where you find that when historical causation is being discussed, and phenomena are being sort of analyzed, one very crucial, one very important element that Annales historians felt that previous historians had left out, one major determinant in that was ecology. Demography, climate change, environment, and so on. And from there onwards began this whole quest of mapping environmental history in that context. On the other hand, if you look at the way that environmental history has come up in the US, or for that matter, even in India, it has really been driven much more by the environmental movement, which began with a sense of doom and crisis. In the 70s and the 60s, actually in the late 60s, with Rachel Carson's Silent Spring, this notion, this idea that some calamitous thing is happening, there is a sense of loss, there's a sense of crisis, and there was a movement that sprung up in order to save the environment, to protect the environment. The research then began from that point of, the inquiry began from that point of interest. And from there onwards, the movement has shaped the research, and the research has fed into the movement. But to get back to your question, at the level of undergraduate research, since you're mostly working with secondary sources, it is really your reading of the secondary sources, which, like the example I gave of the French historians, will throw up questions internal to that corpus itself, where you find gaps in scholarship. You find questions which you can raise, which you don't find anyone else, has raised or tried to answer, and so on. So that is really would be my response to your question. I don't know if that makes sense, but yeah. Yes. Someone else? Any other question?
Good afternoon, ma'am. Ma'am, as you said earlier that during the course of our research and when exposed to the primary or secondary sources, the questions are bound to be changed and rephrased. However, exposed to a broad and thick corpus of literature,
Right.
we might completely derail from what we wanted to do, and that might lead to time delays. So how rigid or flexible should one be to the main question that we decided initially? Because that happens. Yeah, so
Yes. Oh, that's a very, very useful, practical kind of question. And let me tell you that it doesn't just happen at the undergraduate level when you're writing research papers. It happens with people's PhDs. I mean, it sometimes happens that you have begun your sort of research on a certain line of inquiry, and after having explored your primary sources enough, you realize that that whole thing just collapses, and you have to completely rework your question. You have to rework your agenda. Let's say, in the case of undergraduate research, that is that is often even more the case. So when you say how rigid should you be about the original question, I would say you should not be rigid at all. Right? So I've already said that the research question should just be an enabling tool. So it is supposed to be a useful thing. It is supposed to be a very important thing, but it is not supposed to be binding. It is supposed to be an enabling tool, and enabling tools always must be flexible enough to accommodate possibilities of or accommodate new possibilities that may come up. Right? So it's something that should help you open up your sources, should help you it should actually serve as a key to unlock your sources, to open up your sources, and to be able to look at them in a certain. If we go with the analogy of the primary source being like a maze or a labyrinth, the way out of that labyrinth has to be customized for every individual researcher. There's no one path, there's no one way out of it. So as you navigate your way through your secondary or your primary sources, which you're using as your material to do your research, if you have to not only reshape your question, sometimes you may have to entirely rethink your original question. And if you find that that question is not working out, and your material is not really yielding the kind of answers or the kind of material that you wanted to look for, then there is no harm in abandoning that question altogether. But provided you have, and the idea is to not completely collapse yourself when your question collapses, but to be able to stand up again and let the sources then determine the kind of questions you're going to ask. Okay, so I would say that rather than saying should we have to completely abandon the question, or should we have to be rigid and somehow strive for answers to that question, I would say the answer lies somewhere in the middle. Where you have to constantly negotiate between your questions and between what your sources tell you. And you will find that the questions are actually then reshaping themselves quite on their own. All right? So that is my response to your question. I hope that and I know, of course, that time is a huge constraint. I've already mentioned that, which is why at undergraduate level you need to be extremely pragmatic about choosing your sources, choosing your secondary material or primary material or whatever the case may be. But do remember that is only training for research which you will do later on, because whether it is your MPhil or your PhD or any other kind of research is always going to be time bound. So the luxury of going on and sort of exploring endlessly is usually never there. You will always have to come back to your original question, look at your sources, ask whether the sources yield material on the kind of questions you ask, and you have to constantly sort of rework it along the way. So that holds true for everyone. Yeah. Yes. Anything else?
Thank you, ma'am. There is one question in the chat box, which I'll read out.
Okay.
Ma'am, there are Drishti's asking, ma'am, there are many styles of writing a research paper. Which one is the easiest and which should we use?
What are the various...
Can I add to this question?
Yes, sure.
Yes, ma'am. So ma'am, when we're answering a question, so then there are different ways to frame the answer. It can be narrative, it can be description of an event, or it can just focus on the question and can we, when we write a research paper, can we use it as in a narrative sense?
Okay. So I'm so glad you asked that question, and it just made me realize that I probably forgot to emphasize on something very important in my sort of comments, which is, if you remember, I was speaking about the kind of research that you do in school, where you sort of gather information and collect it and collate it and put it together and so on. Now, that is the kind of research. I'm not quite sure whether you can really call it research in the true sense, but whatever you may call it, will always yield a descriptive narrative kind of a paper. Where you're describing events and you're describing things that happen, how it happened and so on. But historical research is never really about telling the story of what happened. It is always about asking questions on why it happened, how it happened, what were the stakes of different people in what happened, and so on. So, I mean, I'm sure you all understand what kind of analytical questions historians ask. So when you're doing research, even at the undergraduate level, however small your paper, even if it is let's say a 3,000 word paper, which you're doing for a project presentation or a project submission, remember that what is important is that, a descriptive paper is never the idea. And which is why the research question, and which is why we're here today and talking about the research question, which is that, unless you have problematized what is already existing knowledge, and you have a specific question to ask or a specific set of questions to ask, your paper will invariably end up being a descriptive sort of a narrative, which it is not meant to be. Which is why I said, when students come to me with topics like, I want to work on classical music in India, I want to work on temple architecture, I want to work on the French Revolution. Now, what specifically about the French Revolution would you like to work on? I would like to work on art in the French Revolution. Okay, so now when you're looking at art in the French Revolution, what do you look at and what do you leave out? Okay, if you don't have a research question, then you end up talking about, let's say, the work of Jacques Louis David, and you talk about his new classicism, and you show some of his paintings. You talk about the shift from Rococo to neoclassical art, and you talk about a whole lot of trends in art without really actually posing a historical question, like maybe how was David's art representative? To what extent was it representative of different sort of stakes or opinions or positions within the French Revolution? Did it reflect a position of power? Was it really talking from the point of view of the state? And so on. So that is why your research paper, even if it is for your project at undergraduate level, it must have a research question or a set of questions to be able to not write a descriptive account. You need to have analysis, you need to analyze, you need to have an investigation, you need to have an interrogation of your sources to come up with, as I said, not finite answers always, but important and interesting questions which will take the inquiry forward, right? I hope that is answered. Yeah. Yes, Drishti, does that answer your question?
Yes, ma'am, that answers my question.
And as teachers, I mean, I can say that, there will be students who will yet, come up with descriptive narratives as their papers. The only thing that you will find in terms of our responses to it, if we are not able to steer a student away from that, is obviously in the way that you'll be graded. So for a paper that may have less information, but may have dealt with a question analytically, discerningly, where your own thought process, where your own processing of data, where your own processing of material is evident, that will certainly carry more weightage. You will get, sort of better grades when you do your own sort of thinking. Right? Even if there are historians who have thought about these questions before, when you are revealing the way that you are kind of approaching these questions and processing those ideas, that is really where you come in as, with something new to offer. Right? Yeah. So, yes.
Thank you, ma'am. And any more questions? You can unmute or you can write in the chat box. I'll read it out. Okay. If there are no more questions, then I think we should tie up this wonderful session. And on that note, I would like to request Bidisha to kindly propose the vote of thanks to ma'am.
Sure. It is a great honor to propose the vote of thanks to you, ma'am. We'd like to express our heartfelt gratitude to Nayana, ma'am, for sharing such useful information and insight into the process of writing a research paper. Thank you, ma'am, for simplifying it for us. I'm sure all of us will think of it when we embark on our respective research projects. Thank you once again for being with us today. We would also like to thank our faculty and friends for being such a wonderful audience. Once again, I thank all for your cordial cooperation. Thank you. The participants may now start leaving.
In case anyone has any questions or any comments, you can stay. Otherwise, yes, you can start leaving. And ma'am, once again, thank you for being with us. We are really happy to have you.
Thank you, and I hope we made some sense in this discussion, and there's something that you're all left with to work on your.
Most definitely, ma'am.